Welcome to Series 4 of the Public Interest Technology PIT Colloquium. We're delighted to be hosting you this series and have an engaging program lined up. My name is Roba Abbas and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Business at the University of Wollongong, Australia, and the Socio-Technical Systems Technical Committee Chair at the IEEE. I'm joined today by my co-host, Katina Michael, who's the Director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University, and is also the Editor-in-Chief of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society. Katina and I would like to acknowledge the work and support of Cindy Dick, Melissa Waite, and the events team at the College of Global Futures at ASU. Before we welcome our guests for today, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the series to date. We journeyed from Series 1, which focused on values, responsible innovation, and COVID-specific technological responses, to Series 2, which centered on storytelling, imagination, and participatory design methodologies, then to Series 3, which emphasized the global perspective with respect to the social, regulatory, and ethical considerations relevant to the design, development, and delivery of technology in the public interest. In this series, which is Series 4, we illuminate a path toward transdisciplinarity, hosting international speakers who will share with us their perspectives on experts and expertise, innovation ecosystems, multi-stakeholder approaches, and the opportunities and challenges relating to the addressing of complex social or societal challenges. Today's session will involve 3 presentations addressing areas such as risk profiling, the right to be forgotten, and open government. We would like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Scarlett Wilcock. Scarlett Wilcock is a lecturer at the University of Sydney School of Law. Her research explores the introduction and effects of new technologies within welfare regimes, including how these technologies may shape or transform welfare law, policy, and practice. She is an associate investigator at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Welfare Rights Centre in Sydney. Dr. Wilcock will be presenting today on risk profiling in the welfare state. Welcome, Scarlett, to the Public Interest Technology Colloquium.
Thank you so much, Roba. So today, what I wish to talk to you about is an examination of algorithmic risk profiling in the welfare state with a focus on the Australian context. And I'll start by briefly outlining my approach, as well as the use of risk profiling more generally in post-Keynesian welfare states. This presentation represents one chapter of a book that is due for publication next year, which represents a larger study on welfare fraud policing. And this is something that examines all the tools and technologies used to police the problem of welfare fraud and non-compliance, from identity verification, data surveillance, etc. The focus today, of course, is on risk profiling technologies, but this is quite a significant part of this overall compliance regime. In this analysis, I'm quite informed and influenced by the critical literature, which urges a contextual approach and also sees these systems as forms of governance, or at least part of assemblages of governing populations. And also to see these systems not as fixed, but as malleable, as I've already foreshadowed. It's also relevant to note that I come at this research as a socio-legal scholar, trained in sociological methods, including some experience as a lawyer representing welfare recipients in Australia. So this enables me to draw important insights, and perhaps different insights, but it also limits the analysis that I can draw, especially from a technical perspective. And it really underscores the importance of future genuinely interdisciplinary work in this area. The data that I draw on today derives from interviews with Centrelink compliance officials, including data miners, intelligence officials, and social security lawyers, as well as large documentary data sources, including public documents, but also lots of documents garnered through the Freedom of Information process. So looking at risk profiling in the post-Keynesian welfare state, I suspect it comes as no surprise to anyone that algorithmic risk profiling and scoring and ranking systems they've really become a common feature, particularly in Western post-Keynesian welfare states, but also beyond those. So we see examples elsewhere as well. A review of the literature, including a 2019 report from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty on the digital welfare state, demonstrates the prevalence of these systems, and it also highlights the common uses of these systems. So there's sort of 3 common uses or areas in which these systems operate in the welfare state. The first and most common is fraud and compliance. The second is in relation to child protection. And the third is about risk and needs scoring. So a system might, for example, predict a welfare recipient's likelihood of long-term unemployment and determine the level of service that that person is therefore met with. In relation to fraud and compliance, which is really where the majority of these systems can be found, these systems tend to employ advanced data analytics, a variety of kinds of techniques to analyze recipient data, to identify and target welfare recipients at apparently higher risk of non-compliance or fraud. It might be focused on a particular kind of risk, such as identity fraud, or a particular population, a subset of the welfare population, such as the unemployed. And increasingly what we see is risk profiling techniques are evolving using larger data sets, more sophisticated, more dynamic and automated technologies, including machine learning. However, generally speaking, the kind of most sophisticated machine learning, the uptake of that has been slower in the welfare state, especially compared to, say, private sector domains like advertising. So we still see a lot of kind of older style predictive techniques being used in the welfare state, including in Australia. A recent, very high profile example of a kind of system that I'm talking about comes from the Netherlands. It's called SIRI, or System Risk Indication System. It came to prominence in 2020 because it was successfully challenged and ceased operation. So a domestic court in the Netherlands found that the system breached the right to privacy in the European Convention on Human Rights, and it had to cease operation. So quite a rare example of this kind of successful legal challenge. This system basically, in very crude terms, used data held by a number of public agencies to identify individuals apparently at higher risk of engaging in welfare fraud. It generated a list of individuals which were then sent to agencies, and that provided the basis of targeting people. So effectively a recommender system. This system was exclusively used against poor and low income neighbourhoods and ethnic minority neighbourhoods. It was challenged on that basis, as I said, and subject to severe criticism, including from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, which called it, explained that it involved an element of victimisation and discrimination that should not be sanctioned by law. Australia, which serves as the empirical focus of the talk today, continues to employ very similar systems, and it's these that I'm going to turn to now. So to provide a little bit of context on the Australian welfare state for those who may not be familiar with it, basically we have a national human services delivery agency known as Service Australia, and the welfare arm of that is called Centrelink. So welfare payments are known as Centrelink payments. In comparison to the welfare states, I'm particularly thinking of the very fragmented, or much more fragmented, system of social protection in parts of the United States. Australia's system is really centralised, it's national, it's very bureaucratic. It's the same payment rates, rules, and apply across the country. It's targeted, so it's a means-tested, highly targeted system funded from general taxation, with payments for different categories of people excluded from the labour market, so parents of young children, the unemployed, people beyond working age, students, etc. In terms of the development of new technologies, a lot of this is actually in-house, and that can contrast to other places where there's much more outsourcing. So certainly Centrelink buys off-the-shelf software. It might contract consultants to adapt, modify that software, or create technical solutions. But a lot of the development, maintenance, implementation of new technical systems is actually in-house. So that by bureaucrats who are also experts under bureaucratic control, and that can be quite different to some other locations and jurisdictions. The first case study is data mining risk profiling project. So in the 2009 to 10 budget, the Australian government provided funding to the Centrelink to establish an ongoing data mining capability in Centrelink that would help identify customers most at risk of receiving incorrect payments. According to Centrelink interviews, and this is supplemented by publicly available information, The data mining team was soon established after this. They used SAS Enterprise Miner software, employed a range of data mining techniques, decision tree methodologies, association rules, etc., to identify patterns and characteristics in the customer data associated with non-compliance and fraud. And that effectively informed decisions about who to target for non-compliance and fraud. As one interviewer explained, we'll usually identify between 30 and 100 parameters. We'll use this as inputs into the model, select the most relevant subset to use, etc. As you can imagine, the data available to Centrelink, and this is reflected in most other welfare agencies elsewhere, these data are vast and they're often highly sensitive. So the most relevant categories of data available for data mining risk profiling are these three categories. The first is demographics as data, and that captures all the personal information about recipients and their families, so the partners and children as well, that things like gender, age, postcode, that kind of information. The second set of data is called transactional data. So that's data derived from recipient engagements with Centrelink. So when a recipient calls the Centrelink, that's a transaction. If they register a change of address, that's a transaction. And so a transactional data might capture the type of transaction, how it's done, for example, phone, online, the outcome, and any tasks that are triggered. So sequences of tasks as well that bureaucrats then follow, whether they're automated or manual. And finally, of course, debt and fraud data. And this is effectively or can be a subset of transactional data, but basically debts raised against recipients, usually within a historically defined time period. Also fraud prosecutions. So as you can see from the previous slide, the customer data includes highly sensitive information. You can add to this list things like disability status, gender as well. This is one of the key concerns with this kind of risk profiling in the critical literature, is that risk instruments, risk profiling systems rely on variables that act as proxies for gender, race, class, and so on. Which can reinforce extant inequalities. These are kind of decontextualized, taken away from historical processes of disadvantage and marginalisation, and then inputted into these systems. But in Australia, it's of course not just the subtle correlations between these things. We actually use the direct correlates. We're directly putting in things that might be gender, etc. So you can see from this quote here, that from one of the interviews. So, you know, we might end up with a profile of someone who's male, aged between this age and that age, and ethnic background. Not that we worry too much about that, you know, and it talks about school leaving, etc. So you can see this is, of course, an example rather than, you know, used as an example rather than a concrete kind of in-use model. But the kind of casualness with which these variables are talked about is telling. It suggests a kind of minimal awareness of what the significance of using these kinds of variables mean, and also the kinds of variables that just are fed in as of course, you know, that are standard to put in. And certainly suggests minimal awareness and suggests that there's not sort of any systematic processes to correct or manage these potential risks of these things emerging. In fact, if you have a look at all the variables that I've come across that are correlates or risk factors associated with non-compliance, all of them are correlated with disadvantage, or virtually all of them are found connected to disadvantage. Some of these come from consultants that publish papers. So just to give you an example, academics from the University of Technology Sydney acted as consultants, and in one of their papers they identified, for example, customers aged 21 to 28 who rent have a partner earning casual income as having a higher probability of welfare overpayment. On the other hand, customers that use only one service centre and receive regular payments were had less likely to incur overpayments. There was quite a lot around home ownership. So if you owned your own home, didn't change service centre, compared to if you were renting and casual income, so that where the former was less likely to get in, the latter is more likely to get into debt. And so this seems to suggest to me, when I look at these variables, I think one suggests housing insecurity and the other suggests housing stability. But there was sort of no reflection on this. Similarly, being male, so gender kept emerging as a predictor, as a useful predictor. So being male was found to be associated with incurring less debt, repaying more debts quickly, and on the other hand, being female was associated with higher levels of debt. And according to another informant, another risk factor, and I quote, number of children. You can almost understand families that are benefit are really vulnerable, not much money, large numbers of children. There could be a tendency not to tell us something that they should, that would have their payment reduced. So a minor insight there that nonetheless fed into these models. And from all these variables, what I saw is a pattern in which I thought certain types of recipients were more likely to be targeted. Unemployed recipients, on kind of more casual and insecure work in housing, and single mothers. That was the kind of things that kept coming up. Obviously, not all the time, this isn't, this kind of thing, but this seemed to be a pattern. And what I thought that this really obscures the fact that these two groups, unemployed recipients and single parents, have long been targeted more frequently in the welfare state. That's not necessarily because they're more likely that there's evidence they're more likely to get into debt. The targeting in the past, which I suspect is embedded in the current data, in the debtor data, tends, and I would argue, is much more related to kind of moral anxieties about these entrenched moral anxieties about these payment recipients who apparently failed to get a job or indeed a man. So what are the effects of data mining risk profiling? What did I see? I'm drawing on the kind of looking at this overall, I saw three interrelated effects that I'll talk briefly about. The first was a veil of objectivity. So the interviewee spoke of the processes, data mining techniques and systems as if they were neutral and objective, and they placed trust in them. There was deference to them. In the words of one interviewee, and I quote, "We let maths and science take over." And this assumption of neutrality, in fact, masks the moral judgments involved in the processes of social security data mining, including the decision to undertake it in the first place, but also suggests a sort of minimal or lack of awareness of the potential for biases to be embedded in data and be reproduced in models. A related problem that I found was what I'm calling distance. So what I saw was this creating a distance between bureaucrats, who are now technicians, or at least between bureaucrats and the collective impact of their work, and their targets, so welfare recipients that they're targeting. One issue I was keen to investigate in my research was the reason why women, and particularly single mothers, were overrepresented in fraud prosecution statistics. And I put this to all interviewees, and not one knew about this fact. So all of them expressed surprise. And here's what one of the interviewees said in relation to that, putting that fact to them. "Well, I have to admit that I didn't know that. When I look at prosecution results and data, and the data that comes back and forth, and because I work in the Centrelink mainframe, I guess my excuse is I've always looked at cases based on the populations they come from, and I'm so analytical, it's not really people," okay? But it is people, isn't it? But you can see how this creates this distance between the technician now, the bureaucrat as technician, and the outcomes, the social and other outcomes of the work here. So what this suggests, and ultimately the kind of outcomes, is that this kind of system suggests the burdens of risk profiling are tending to coagulate and disproportionately affect already disadvantaged welfare recipients, and this may just propel the disadvantage that those groups are already facing. What's interesting is that risk governance and risk profiling is having really different effects elsewhere in the welfare state. And it's important to note these haven't replaced what I just talked about. These are alongside, okay? So they're not a replacement. In around 2015, a new tiered compliance review regime was introduced, and it continues to operate today, pretty much unchanged. So a few tweaks, but fairly unchanged. Basically, it involves the use of data analytics and data mining to rank payment recipients by their apparent risk of non-compliance. associated with sort of high level program risk, so not reporting income, for example, if you have casual income. The risk that the risk score determines the tier of intervention, and there's 3 tiers. So the bottom is sort of the least interventionist and indirect intervention. So an SMS message, for example, to prompt or remind people to report their income. Early intervention is the next step up, usually involving a phone call, an educative moment, if you like, and direct intervention is more about a more familiar form of payment review. This system is explicitly informed by behavioural economics and the kind of nudge approach that some of you may be familiar. And the core goal was to kind of maintain compliance results, but reduce the number of costly compliance reviews. So efficiency really being core there. In many respects, this bears all the hallmarks of kind of neoliberal active welfare state. The focus is on individual failings, modifying individual behaviour that apparently needs correcting. A core goal is efficiency, etc. But actually what I found in this particular setting that staff were engaged in a little bit more than that. There was a kind of adaptation of this process. And what I saw was certainly a more complicated picture. So what I saw was that the approach led to far less accusatory, intrusive, and ultimately softer interactions between staff and welfare recipients. Again, this is in one setting. I think overall the experience of welfare recipients is of a punitive system. But in this particular site, this was occurring. It seemed to change the way Centrelink staff perceived the problem of welfare non-compliance in the first place. Yes, it was about individuals' need for compliance, but part of it was also a sort of subtle systemic analysis of the social security and it's being too complex as a problem, and that was kind of built into this system. And the interviewees I spoke to all spoke positively about this and about them being able to trust welfare recipients. So at least in those first 2 tiers of intervention, the welfare recipient's account is taken at face value. There's no independent verification. There's no intrusive calls to their employer, the kid's school, etc. And so it seems to temper this assumption, this general assumption that recipients are dishonest. In this way, the idea of risk of non-compliance is remedied. It's in some way reconceived as needs. So instead of risks of non-compliance was the person is in need of education. The system is in need of reform and simplification. I'm not suggesting that the system is unproblematic, and it can lead to many of the problems I spoke to in relation to the risk profiling, the data mining activities. It's still primarily focused on post-hoc management rather than prevention. It still has a kind of soft systemic analysis rather than really taking on what could be root causes of welfare non-compliance. And still this kind of politics of nudge nonetheless focuses on individual behaviour modification. It still presents to some extent recipients simply as lacking the skills, knowledge and agency to manage their lives, rather than inquiring whether the system itself is indeed the system of welfare provision as a whole is legitimate, fair and effective. But it's nonetheless a really strong reminder of how these systems can play out quite differently depending on their context and goals and staff to which they are responsible for them. And it's really important to keep an eye to this kind of nuanced and unexpected outcomes. In the final few minutes, and I hope that I've got a few minutes, is that right, Rover? That I want to just briefly reflect on sort of what's happening now and what might happen next. Most of these interviews were undertaken in 2014 and 15. The documentary data has been updated since, and I haven't been able to do other interviews. The welfare state has been a little bit less inviting to researchers in recent years. Nonetheless, from what I can gather, there's 2 key developments that are worthy of consideration. I don't think these have really changed the processes so far. I would suggest that change is more incremental than transformational because there's not necessarily evidence that these things are currently affecting how welfare fraud and compliance work is operating, but it might, and therefore I think it deserves critical attention. So the 2 things that I think are most significant is, well, the first is the availability of more and new types of data to the welfare state. So Centrelink continues to collect that kind of demographic and transactional data associated with claiming and receiving welfare payments. But the rapid expansion of the digital welfare state means that there's just been an expansion in the variety of quantity of data available. According to Centrelink's data analytics privacy notice, Centrelink now captures things like claimants' IPs addresses, screen size, orientation, mouse clicks, mouse hovers, how claimants move through web pages, etc. Other information includes, and data includes biometric data when recipients set up voice prints. There's location data in apps and things like that. So broadly speaking, the data available to Centrelink is more voluminous, more diverse, more granular, and far more removed from the official file. So the other data was very much part of that official file. This is moving beyond that. At the same time, we know that techniques for data analysis and data analytics are multiplying and diversifying and becoming far more sophisticated. So there's obviously the kind of development of machine learning technologies, etc. As I said, there's not a great deal of evidence that this has all been used in the compliance work yet. These data could be, there's nothing to stop Centrelink from using these data. And what I can gather, the real push have been for sort of real-time risk profiling, and that's really been the only push. I can't see significant other changes. Nevertheless, if we were to see these changes implemented, I think there's three things that could be outcomes to this, or things that we could watch and explore further. So in combination, these developments could create even more distance between welfare compliance officials and recipients who are the targets of compliance work. So of course, this is something I spoke to in relation to data mining, but would be an intensification of this issue. So the introduction of more sophisticated technologies could just increase that deference to these systems and reduce opportunities for understanding, reflection, adaptation, including that contestation that I spoke about in relation to the tiered compliance model. At the same time, as algorithmic risk profiling might become more sophisticated, it becomes less explicable, perhaps less contestable. So this is obviously not a new problem. There's already a level of sort of impenetrability here, but there's at least some capacity, even for me, a non-technician, to sort of reverse engineer hypotheses, or at least ask questions about this, meaningful questions about these kinds of variables, about why. The further that these systems move away from consideration of why may no longer be important, I think our capacity to challenge the systems is reduced as well. We're expected to sort of accept these inexplicable algorithms on faith, and this is obviously going to become an even very serious problem if what we find out is that they are in fact systemizing harm. However, I think that machine learning risk profiling could have the capacity to redistribute and disperse welfare surveillance in surprising ways. So all of a sudden, if we're not just focusing on that official file, what happens if we chuck mouse clicks into the mix? Maybe that might disperse and shift attention from single mothers, maybe for a moment. Maybe it won't. I think that we should be aware and open to the possibility of interesting outcomes here that may displace or at least modify some of the traditional social categories that keep emerging in these kinds of systems. It also has, at the same time, the potential to lead to new forms of discrimination, which may be less visible to us and harder to sort of detect. As Mann and Matzer explained, the input and output of algorithmic systems may not have a direct relation to a protected ground, such as race, class, for example, but it might still be the case that an algorithmic system systematically disadvantages persons with, say, a specific combination of browsing history, make of computer, etc. So algorithmic profiling may ultimately bring about systematic disadvantage for an otherwise unnoticed group of people. Alternatively, and this is many scholars would suggest this, it may just simply continue to propel familiar patterns of discrimination, systematic discrimination to their predecessors, albeit in more invisible and insidious ways. It still tend to use decontextualized data, obfuscate the significance of ethical social effects, etc. So ultimately, it would seem that the introduction of sort of smarter algorithmic profiling technologies and new data in the welfare state may intensify and enlarge existing problems, but it also may create and alleviate some. It may do so in surprising and unexpected ways. So thank you so much for that, and I'll take any questions, of course.
Thank you so very much, Scarlett. I think your talk really speaks to the importance of the critical lens regarding risk profiling effects, the rearticulation of risk. You spoke to tiers of intervention and some of the challenges that we need to address, certainly in the context of the digital welfare state and risk profiling, more specifically, where potentially risk needs to be reframed in terms of needs. I really appreciate how you ended the discussion with some of the interesting outcomes that come with the introduction of sophisticated technologies. We will have a chance to reflect, hopefully, and ask some questions, many questions stemming from your excellent presentation. But first, I'll turn to our second speaker for today, Dr. Andrew Whelan. Andrew Whelan is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia. His research interests lie in the relations between emerging technologies and formal and informal social organisations. Dr. Whelan has published his research in a range of outlets, including Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, Critical Social Policy, Critical Sociology, and the Sociological Review, among others. Currently, Andrew is working on algorithmic social welfare and processes of data erasure, and additionally writing a book for MIT Press, or provisionally titled Destruction of Documents. Dr. Whelan will present today on the topic of the right to be forgotten has a material history. Over to you, Andrew, and welcome to the colloquium.
Thanks, Robbie. So yeah, I have some slides, but they're really just to kind of help me sequence the argument. They're pretty kind of minimalist, so I'll speak with them rather than to them, as it were. So yeah, I'm Andrew Whelan. I'm at the University of Wollongong. My email is up there. I like talking about these things, so drop me a line if you want to communicate about these things. And so yeah, thanks for having me, Roba and Katina. And I'd also like to just take the opportunity to thank Roba and Scarlett, because I've learned a great deal from talking to you both about data and datification and these types of large-scale processes. And I'm just glad to have the opportunity to kind of get that on the record somewhere. So this is what I'm talking about is chapter 3 of the book that Roba mentioned, and this is about the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, Article 17 of the GDPR, which is European Union legislation, which came into effect in 2018. And it's essentially the most stringent data privacy protection regulation in the world. There's something sort of interesting about it, which is, as you can see, the right to be forgotten is given in brackets in the title of this piece of legislation, but the right to be forgotten does not appear in the main body of the text, where it's formulated as the right to erasure. So somehow, sort of historically, these two things got smudged together in kind of an interesting way. And that's part of what I'm going to try to sort of unpack or rummage around in, is how that came about and what that means and what kind of limits that puts on things. So this is a kind of overview of what I'm going to do or to try to say. I'm just going to first talk about essentially how I'm sort of, as it were, methodologically situating erasure. So trying to talk about erasure as a practical activity rather than a sort of a principle. I'm also going to try to situate erasure in terms of or rather to situate Article 17, erasure as given by Article 17, in the context of European history and in the context of recent, what we know about recent government surveillance that occurs via digital media. I'm then going to talk about the history of erasure in expungement and the droit à l'oubli, the right to be forgotten or the right to oblivion in French common law and European common law and in the in the United States, a legal oblivion, as it were. And then I'm going to essentially make the case, which is that relative to what I'm going to call the sociology of the FAMG, and by that I mean the big tech oligopoly, right? Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. I don't know why it's not now. I suppose it should be called the MAM, because presumably it's now Meta, Alphabet, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. But anyway, that's just confusing. So I'm just going to keep calling it the FAMG for now. And I'm going to describe what I'm going to call the sociology that they conduct, which is the basis of their business model, and how erasure essentially doesn't, it seems like it's going to go near there, but it doesn't actually touch that. And then I'm going to suggest also that it individualizes the data subject in a problematic way, rather than engaging directly with the implications of datification. So for that reason, I'm going to say that individual rights are a rather peculiar politico-legal and discursive mechanism. So where I kind of come from as a sociologist is what you're looking at there is a quote from Dorothy Smith, and this is a type of sort of sociological orientation called institutional ethnography, which where the interest is in trying to follow the social and administrative implications of the circulation of media or the circulation of texts and the formulation of texts and their affordances. So what texts do in terms of how they sort of constitute people and constitute people's movements and relationships relative to large organizations. So one of the sort of key, a kind of bedrock principle in this approach is that you, rather than getting kind of hung up on the meanings of documents or on what documents might say or what data might say, you try to just keep paying attention to what they do and to how they're used and to how they sort of coalesce or disperse people or social or economic or political power around them. So trying to keep sort of paying attention to text in a very generous interpretation of what a text is, right? So not just, you know, a document or a book, but, you know, a video or a set of emails or a set of PDFs or indeed data. So in institutional ethnography, you know, we kind of, people acknowledge you can't really get away from political and sociological arguments about how things are and how they got to be the way that they are. But the sort of premise is that you can shed some light by just trying to stay with the material practices of the circulation of media and their historical development, right? To look at what we're doing rather than why we say we're doing it. So in that way, then, by trying to pay attention to what it is that people actually do with media, we could try to shed some light on why they claim they have organized things in the way that they have. So it's another way to try to get some kind of critical purchase on what's going on. So erasure is viewed, the right to be forgotten in the GDPR is viewed sometimes by American legal scholars as contentious insofar as it seems to run contrary to First Amendment free speech rights. And one of the reasons why that can be confusing is because Europeans don't necessarily say it very explicitly, but the European sort of culture of privacy and data management has to be situated relative to European history in the 20th century. So Europeans are extremely sensitive about population data. France does not collect census data on ethnicity or religion. In Germany, there have been census boycotts. Notably, there was quite a big one in 1983. Germans became especially sensitive about census data when it started to become handled electronically. So in 1978, in Germany, there was a Federal Data Protection Act, which distinguished data, it distinguished digital data from data gathered via documents. So this is a long-running concern in Europe. And this is, of course, partly to do with the consequences of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So, you know, Europeans remember how census data and other types of documents were used in World War II. And they also remember the forms of state surveillance conducted by totalitarian state socialist governments in Eastern Europe, and also by secret police under far-right or fascist governments, including under Mussolini in Italy, the secret police under Salazar in Portugal, the Social Investigation Brigade under Franco in Spain, right? So that's all within memory, as it were, and it kind of shapes the landscape there. And it's actually addressed in GDPR Article 9, which refers to special categories of personal data, which is exactly that type of data. And it sets out very careful parameters around how some kinds of sensitive, essentially politically sensitive data should be handled. So we kind of have to have that history in our minds when we try to understand what's happening in Europe. But we also need to understand the recent history of big data state surveillance. And I'm referring here to things we know from Edward Snowden in 2013, where Facebook and Google and Microsoft and others are known to exchange data with intelligence agencies in Europe and North America and Anglophone Australasia. GCHQ is the government communications headquarters. It's like the British spooks, an intelligence agency. And Black Hole is the name of what they call their flat data store. So it's essentially a massive intelligence service data repository. And they have various interfaces which interact with Black Hole, all of which have quite cool names like Mutant Broth or Memory Hole or Social Anthropoid. And there's one called Karma Police, which is obviously named after the Radiohead song, which is used to do what it says there up on the screen, but also they can use it to conduct pattern of life analysis on individual users to detail when and where people are active online. So there's a form of surveillance there which is not just massive, like incredibly massive, but also has been used in rather insidious ways. So, for example, GCHQ, Mutant Broth used GCHQ data to follow Facebook cookies and thereby to identify employees at Gemalto, a company which makes SIM cards. And they did that because they wanted to get the encryption keys by which SIM cards are encrypted. They also attacked the Belgian telecoms company Belgacom in order to conduct what they call man-in-the-middle attacks. So that's where they can kind of get into the smartphone of a target and they can intercept and modify communications between targets, right? So given the history of the 20th century in Europe that I was just describing, and also given obviously recent and indeed current political events, it might be safe to say that we could have good grounds for caution around the kinds of surveillance activity that states have conducted and do conduct, just given the political and economic and ecological context that we're in. So that's a kind of macro kind of picture of what you were sort of, what you're in when you're thinking about data capture relative to the state and state legislation around data capture. So the right to be forgotten, which is described in brackets in the GDPR, the history of it is in the droit à l'oubli in French law. They have a similar right in Italy, and in the United States it's called expungement. So this is what is called common law record relief. Australia, Canada, the European Union, New Zealand, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States have sealing and expungement processes. In many jurisdictions, the records of juveniles are automatically sealed or expunged at the age of majority. For example, in the United States, that's at around 17 or 18. In the United States, expungement first emerged in the 1940s. Specifically with respect to juvenile records. Expungement also occurs where laws are retrospectively repealed, as for example with the repeal of vice or morality statutes, such as those criminalizing sexual practices or the supply and possession of cannabis. There's currently significant momentum in the United States towards what is called clean slate or automatic record relief. There's a reason for that, which is that expungement is a benefit to record bearers, to their families and their communities, and to society at large, right? It mitigates many of the collateral consequences of encounters with the criminal justice system. It lowers recidivism rates, and it increases the earnings of the formerly justice involved. But expungement also paradoxically erases the historical record of unjust law and the scale of its effects. Expungement can also compromise the data through which provision for support services is allocated, and importantly, in the United States context, through which structural racism in criminal justice and policing becomes documentable and quantifiable. So there's this interesting kind of tension or dynamic between what expungement can do for individuals and between what it can do for society's understanding of itself. And that tension or dynamic kind of foreshadows the limits of erasure, as we'll see presently. So why is it in brackets there? Because of this legend, Costeja Gonzalez, who is the guy, the case was called Google Spain, and it went to the European Court of Justice in 2014. Costeja Gonzalez was a Spanish man, and he wanted links to old newspaper articles about him removed from Google search results. And the Google Spain case predates and sets the scene for the GDPR, even though the GDPR and the right to erasure was in train for a very long time in Europe before the Google Spain case. Now, the reason why I'm sort of talking about this is because of the slightly peculiar nature of the right that it is, the right to be forgotten. Costeja Gonzalez wanted these links, he wanted Google to remove links in search results for his name to an old debt recovery sale of property. And there's one of the implications of this is that the right to be forgotten appears in this sort of peculiar way. It's sort of like a right with its tail between its legs, if you know what I mean. Because Costeja Gonzalez is a kind of a Trojan horse, because you're sort of sympathetic to him. And so, you know, why would he be hounded by ancient records? But at the same time, it sort of constitutes the right of the data subject as if they require a second chance despite past indiscretions, right? So, and it formulates the right to be forgotten as if it was essentially a reputational one. It's about how other people who use this media might encounter the data subject. So it casts the right in a weird sort of moral light when it's put in that context about erasure. So, So I'm just going to move this now into what I'm calling the sociology of the FAMG, right? The type of sociology that they do, the kind of value proposition that they have. And I might just say also, Roba, do tell me if I ought to hurry up or if I start to look like I'm going over time. So I'm describing this as a sociology because they're generating knowledge about society and monetizing it. That's how the big tech oligopolies operate. And the value of the data to them lies at the population level. It's about building profiles and probabilities and predictions. So the value of data inheres in the predictive promise of the social categories that can be inferred from it, right? It's about knowing things about people that they might not know themselves. And it's about predicting what an individual in a given category might think or want just when they want it, or even optimally a little bit before they know that they want it. And that's the promise that companies like Google make to advertisers, right? That's the basis of the revenue stream. It's about building inferential and predictive knowledge. So one of the implications of that is that data is relational, right? Data as a commodity, its value lies in the kind of sociology that a company like Google can do with it. And this is a sort of an echo of what Scarlett was saying. But data is also relational in its derivation, in that it comes from the actions of people interacting with machines and with each other. It's collectively derived. It's an exhaust of common action. It's also, data is also relational in that inevitably data about an individual can be and will be used as information about their local social context. That is to say, geographically and in social network terms. For example, your private data on your phone includes your contact list and your Facebook friends and so on. So there isn't really monadic or atomic individual level data in that sense. So you have then a kind of a problem of data disempowerment, right? One of the things that the sociology of the FAMG generates is a kind of epistemic asymmetry, where things are known about people, but people don't know what is known about them, and they don't necessarily know how their media environment is being modulated around that knowledge. So people lose control over their data, and they also lose control or some kind of understanding about what's going on. So that is to say, an exit politics of erasure doesn't address that. The problem of the sociology of the FAMG is a governance problem. It's not a rights problem. And this is actually before you get to problems inside data systems which use machine learning and AI and so on, where it's actually very difficult to pull an individual's data out or to work out how to locate all of an individual's data in an unstructured data set. So exit in that sense, the right to erasure seems like a largely passive and a largely negative right. The interest we have in our data is social, and it is political because of the way data is social and relational in the way that I was just describing. And it involves not only our rights individually, but also collectively, but also our interactions with and obligations to one another, given that's how the data is generated. So this is close to the neighborhood where people start talking about a delete button, where they just say, why can't I just delete it myself? Why do I have to ask somebody else permission? And also where people start talking about markets in data. Why doesn't Facebook just pay all of its users on the basis of the value that they're generating for the company? But neither of those things are really solutions to the problem that I'm trying to get at. And so your data is already having an effect on other people, but you're not allowed the social or the moral responsibility or autonomy to have those effects organized in a way that you might want. So the problem is not just that an individual's data is appropriated or is used in a sense against them for marketing purposes. Viljun I found this article actually very helpful. She's drawing on feminist political theory about recognition. And the point that is kind of being made here is that whether you're in the data set or whether you erase yourself from it, you still have not been able to act on or to recognize your relations with others as they are evidenced in the data. You haven't been able to achieve mutual recognition with them. And in a sense, the right to erasure thus means that what you've actually been given is a right to exacerbate inequality with others. You don't get a right to recognize or articulate jointly with other people in the data set what your shared interests might be and what the potential risks of that data might be for you as a group or as a society. So whether you opt out or you stay in, you don't get to take responsibility for how your actions affect others relative to the context in which your data is being mined. And in fact, even if you do exit, the profile of people just like you is still there and will still act on you. So the idea then would be that datafication is kind of exacerbating existing social harms by depriving knowledge of them, and is building on and sedimenting categories of differentiation which are already unequal and are used in politically damaging ways. There's an opportunity cost to datafication in terms of the social and economic ends to which it's oriented, and it constitutes a social harm in itself. So for that reason, individual rights are just a peculiar mechanism to try to deal with the sociology of the FAMG, right? And we kind of know that this is in the minds of the boffins, as it were, in the European Union who are devising these systems. We know that they want to have a run at companies like Google. And we know that they recognize in some way that wholly privatized datification is a kind of a moral injury. So why is erasure posited as a solution? You know, why is that? And so one way of thinking about it is that maybe it's a kind of a compliance nudge. Maybe what the European Union is doing is saying, if we sort of require large companies to be able just to provide people's data, even if no individual ever really asks for it, then we can limit datification or slow it down. Or another kind of interpretation, which is the one that Zuboff makes in the Surveillance Capitalism book, is that maybe that's the first salvo in a bigger kind of battle, a bigger legal battle about datification. But it seems still to be a kind of a strange kind of logic, because it gives all of the power to the data collector, right? If you want Google to erase your data, you've got to ask them, and you don't really know what they do with that question. So another way of kind of formulating what I'm saying here is to say that rights are also a technology. Rights are a political and administrative and a discursive technology. So it's really hard to say you're against rights, right? Nobody says, I don't like those rights and I don't want them. That's a sort of an impossible thing to say. So rights are a very powerful political and administrative technology, but it doesn't seem like they're going to get at the kind of damage that we're talking about when we're talking about datification in the way that I'm describing it. And the history of expungement, I think, shows that it's not an adequate tool to address the history of the abuse of records by the state, even before we get to entirely privatized datification. So one way then of sort of wrapping things up or of trying to put that somewhere is to say that rights are a kind of a discursive and a political and administrative technology, but are they the ones that you kind of want? Are they the best ones that you could get to think about technologies that are in the public interest? And that's it. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a fabulous way to end your presentation, and so much to say on that point in particular. I really appreciate the richness of the presentation about datification, rights as a technology, erasure as a practical activity, and the importance of the historical perspective from that European perspective that really permeates data protection, to the embeddedness within state corporate surveillance contexts, and also tying to the predictive capabilities and knowledge as aligned with Scarlett's presentation. What's really interesting is that the relational aspects, which somewhat render Article 17 insufficient given the focus of the individual. We will return to your talk in a moment, Andrew, but I will move on now to our third presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker for today, Professor Maren Jansen. Maren Jansen is a full professor in ICT and governance in the Technology Policy and Management faculty of the Delft University of Technology. He's particularly interested in situations in which multiple public and private organizations seek to collaborate, where ICT plays an important enabling role, where organizational realities and political wishes constrain socio-technical solutions, and where there are also various ways to proceed. Professor Jansen is the co-editor-in-chief of Government Information Quarterly, is the president of the Digital Government Society, chair of the IFIP Working Group 8.5 in ICT and Public Administration, and also the conference chair for IFIP eGov. Among his many achievements, Professor Jansen was ranked as one of the leading e-government researchers in surveys in 2009, 2014, and 2016, was one of the 100 most influential people in digital government worldwide in 2018 and 2019, and has also published over 600 referee publications with a Google H index of 80 and in excess of 25,000 citations. Professor Jansen's Pitt Colloquium presentation is on open government, more than transparency, and we'll now hear from Professor Jansen.
Thank you for your nice introduction, Boba, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to talk about public interest technology. And personally, I love technology. because technology can be used for the good. It can be used for improving our society, for tackling our ground challenges in a variety of ways, but it's always different than we expect. That's why we had also in this series the discussions about the ethical issues and the presentations about that. What I want to talk about today is about open government. And open government is a kind of reaction to that the government is acting on its own and the public doesn't know what's happening. So in one way or another, the government has to be opened to the public and to create some level of transparency. But it's more than transparency, because transparency alone might not be enough. Furthermore, we are never sure what is meant with transparency. And I prefer to talk about some level of transparency instead of using the term transparency. So we can increase the transparency, but we might never have full transparency. I will come back to you those slides. And there are a couple of elements that are very important and need to be considered. First, take a very simple and traditional example. I think all countries have this. I just took them from the UK. It's already a bit old. This is the open spending. And some people say this is a really nice example of open government, because you can see what is spent, how it is spent. You can zoom in how much money is spent on health, how much money is spent on education, and you can start influencing it. So people think wow, this is transparent because I know now how my budget is spent. But try to zoom in. To which level do you know your budget is spent? If it's spent on health, do you also know what kind of health it is spent? How much the emergency unit will get? So the question always is from how far do we go and what let we show? And if we show all the details, what happened, you can say we have some high level of transparency, but you might be lost in the details. If it's too high level, we might not sure anymore if it's really going on, and it might just give a direction, but we might not have sufficient data. So that's why it's so difficult to create some level of transparency. When you talk about open government, it's about mechanisms for ensuring effective public oversight. Yeah, and that's what you want to do. And for that, you want to need the society, the public, and they look inside the government to take a look at it. And it contains a couple of elements. The first element that's very important, and is in the name, openness. And openness means that you open the black box, right? You can see inside the black box and you see what is going on, and then you can take a next step. Often the next step is, once you open it, the black box, that's transparency. And you already know it, some level of transparency. Very important, because what you open is also determines what you see. If you look outside your window, the window over here, when I look outside, I can see, and it looks transparent, but I see a couple of trees, I see some buildings, but I don't know what is next to it. So that's also with transparency. It's on the eye of the beholder, and who opens the data determines also the transparency. Once we have some level of transparency, we can talk about accountability. And accountability is about keeping persons responsible for its actions or its inactions, lack of actions. So why did you act in a certain way? Why did you make a decision in a certain way? Or why didn't you making a decision in a certain way? And accountability can also be at all levels. It can be about a certain permit that is granted or not granted, but it can also be about a policy, a new policy concerning the energy transition and the use of solar energy or something like that. So it can be very detailed about individual level, but it can also be at the aggregate level. Once we have accountability, we often talk about one of the elements, and that's called participation or engagement. Well, just opening data, well, if nobody uses it, there will be no transparency and also no accountability. So you need some level of participation. People who start using the data, look inside it, make use of it, and they start also often discussing in it. And nice examples of participation that goes completely outside the government. So people start discussing with each other, and then they have renewed insights, and then they come back to the government to ask them for the accountability. Participation is an essential ingredient. And often the reason for starting open government is to increase trust, trust of society in the government. But you can imagine that something else might happen. When you open the black box, when you make it transparent, and you help people accountable, and you see that things are not going that well, that's why we need accountability to improve our setting, it might be that trust doesn't go up, but trust might go down, because people see what's really happening over here. If it's a black box, you can't see the problems. If it's a white box or a gray box, you open it a little bit, you can see the problems. So often we assume that there's some relationship between openness and trust, and that trust will increase. But in contrary to the common belief, often trust doesn't go up, but might even go down due to open government. Doesn't mean we don't need open government. Of course, we need open government, and it's also temporary often. First, you see the problems, then you have the participation, the engagement. You can start with addressing the problems, and at the end, trust can go up. So it might be on the long term. But think about the effects and what you're focused on. So about the elements of the open government. Transparency is often what Ricardo Mateus, one of my PhD candidates, is called the window theory, is about opening the windows. And you see here a window, the window is closed, you can't see inside, you can only see the bricks in the walls. And what you want to do is you want to create some level of transparency. And how do you do it? By combining data together. Only then you can create transparency. It's never a single source of data. It's always combining various sources of data. And providing access to the data, people can start analyzing and making all kinds of conclusions. You might look at what's the pollution near your own area where you're living in. You can look at where's the origin of the pollution or something like that, that kind of data. But it can also be budget data we talked about. There's a variety of data and all kinds of elements that are part of it. And once we create some transparency, we open the window, look at the bright sunny weather outside, every people is happy. And transparency is intuitive, very appealing. Everybody wants transparency. And most people I talk about wants transparency. But transparency is also a concept that needs to be implemented and translated. And once you translate it into the operations, you get into those discussions. Oh, what happens if I open privacy sensitive information? Oh, you don't want to have that level of transparency. What about other type of data? So at a high level, often we all agree we need transparency, but at the implementation level, when we look at the operations and specific data, we might not like it. So everybody likes transparency, but not about themselves, in short. So think about that. And that makes it also a difficult trade-off. And that's why we need also to have a certain view on the world. And what you see over here is, instead of the bright, sunny air, we see clouds. And currently it's here cloudy. It's correct what I'm seeing over here. And what you see is you have some level of transparency. So you can see some things that are happening, but you might not have all the details. And that's also the information asymmetry that is between those who know what's really happening in the black box inside the building and what's happening outside the building, outside the black box. When you look at it, you have less data. You have less information. You will never know what's exactly happening inside, but you might have sufficient data. And that's what in the accountability area one is saying. For accountability, you might not need all data, but you need some level of data and sufficient data to ensure that you can help people accountable. So you don't need all the in and outs. It's the same with transparency. We don't need all the in and outs to have complete transparency, because complete transparency would be very expensive. Imagine that you go to your president or prime minister and you will follow him all day in all meetings. That's complete transparency. You don't want that to happen. You don't have time for that. So what you want to know is what are the main decisions and what happened over there. What you do in general is that we think that more data results in transparency and more trust. But think about it, more data can result into a huge information overload, all kinds of sources. We don't know the data quality of those sources. So the more data you have, the less transparency you might have, and also the less trust you might have, because it's like, you see some clouds and you get more and more clouds, and you don't see the sun anymore due to all those clouds. So that's also the difficulty with transparency, and to create data into transparency in this case. And what we are doing then, in fact, and I always take this picture to have a basic understanding, is what we're doing for creating those kinds of understanding for transparency is we take all kinds of data that's often unstructured, and we start structuring that. Think about this presentation. How is this structured data? Well, you can look at the keywords. You can look at the title. That's the structure. Of course, some unstructured part, and you have to watch the video. And we have also the move from closed to open data. Doesn't mean that it has to be opened for all. No, it doesn't mean it has to be opened for all. You have to open it for a certain group. It could be that you open some data as a government for the accountability office, that the accountability office is able to look at accountability and they do the job. Sometimes the public might be interested, but they don't have the resources, or they don't have the ability to look at it. And not everybody has a PhD in accountability. At least I don't have a PhD in accountability. Think about that in that way. And then we move to something what we call linked open statistical data. Why is linked so important? Because we connect all data together. And if we link it together, then it's easy to connect. And in the ideal situation, we can ask a question. What is the amount of budget spent on avoiding pollution in my area? What's the source of the pollution in my area? So instead of that you push the data to you, you try to ask questions, and you focus on the questions on the need. So you try to reverse what is going on. And that's also why those technologies are so important, because they can reverse the game. What's happening over here? And you can ask questions, and then you get the answers to your questions. Instead, you get a huge data overload. And that's why data ranking is very important, and the type of ranking. This is the famous ranking of Tim Berners-Lee, the 5 stars model over there. And if data is hidden in a PDF, it's 1 star. If it's 2 stars, if in Excel, because you can start manipulating it a little bit, it's a CSV file, then you get 3 stars. RDF, that's a tool to link data together, and then we can manipulate data, the resource data framework. Then we are able to give it 4 stars, and in the ideal situation, we have linked open data, LOD, then we have 5 stars. Because I talked about that, if we link the data together, then we can start asking questions, and then we know what it is. RDF ensures for the semantics, that we have ensure that we have basic understanding, and linked data is that we can ask questions, and the data sources are connected to each other. But what's the case? Often data is not opened as linked open data. We're already quite happy if it's Excel spreadsheet, or it's a CSV file or something like that. So it's often basic, but we have to move to the right to have it really focused on it. And of course, we did some research on it, and often, people say we have linked open data, but in fact, they didn't have linked open data. So technology enables a lot, but we're not using it yet. That's also some of the questions. And what kind of challenges do we encounter now? Well, if we have a haystack, we can conclude that finding the right data is like the needle in the haystack. We're not able to find the right data. The first question is, where is the data? Where's the open data portal? And often we have multiple open data portals. Oh no, each city has an open data portal. Oh, departments within the city have an open data portal. You see, it gets more difficult. Then the question is, who owns it, or who has the data? If you're not able to find it, sometimes it's not released. Who can I ask for it? And once you have the data, what's the quality of the data? Are you sure that it has the right quality and the right format? Then how the data can be linked. Then visualization is also needed, and having a user-centric view on it. If you have just plain data, well, nobody makes sense of it. You need to have high manipulation. You need a data scientist, somebody with those kind of background. And you can't expect that from the public. Then the focus on public value creation. Yeah, well, the whole seminar is about public values and creation and those kinds of things. Very difficult to do. Then how can bias in the data be avoided? Because what often happens, and that's what we saw at the beginning, the spending of data, is that the people who open the data, they determine what you can see. And for sure, it's biased. They will ensure that you see the good things and how to spend, and that you might not see the things you shouldn't see. So there's always bias in data. And that means also you have to think about how data can be used to address a societal problem. And then the question is transparency created, or a predefined view on the world is created? Excuse me for my Dutch in it, I speak double Dutch. So the question is, how do you do this? And this might look like a simple problem, but it's a very complex problem. We have many technologies come together, and many ethical and public value discussions also come together. And that's why we have a trade-off. And it might even be more difficult. I like to show this example about open agriculture data. The Netherlands is below the sea level. You might know that almost 2/3 is below the sea level in one way or another, depending on how high the view is. And we have a lot of agriculture. And all those farmers, they do their own agriculture. But they are satellites. And satellites, they have a lot of information about the soil, about the temperature over time, about the use of nitrogen, about the water quality that is part of it. But you can imagine that farmers don't have access to it. Maybe a very big farmer might be able to do it, but most of them, they don't. So what did the Dutch government do? They said, well, we have those data. We will open it. We will pay for it, and we will ensure that it will be open for the public. But we need also to ensure that it will be used. You can't expect that farmers will look at those data and analyze that. They are not data scientists. So there were intermediaries that results in the use of the data. They will make sense of the data, analyze it, visualize the data. And then once they do it, it's open data. They can provide all kinds of services to it. For example, what is the right moment of planting new things on the land, or fertilizing, or something like that. They try to collect a collection of services, and that results in the better use of the land, and they can use it also to improve their revenues in that way by better use it, and it can result in a more efficient and sustainable agriculture. So that's why it's so important. So this is maybe a non-typical example that we took over here, but it shows how value can be created and societal benefits from data, because we want to have sustainability in agriculture. One of the UN goals, of course, related to sustainability on the long term, and the environment and what you want. There's some transparency over there, and you help the people. But somebody has to make an investment, in this case the Dutch government, and you need companies, intermediaries, to start using the data. And at the beginning, there were also incentives for intermediaries to make sure that the data could be used and do it. Yeah, and what I think is happening, and you saw it also in this example, is that the whole governance and the relationship between citizens, businesses, politicians, public administration, it's all shifting. look at what's just happened over here. It's not the government that's taking the lead and saying that something should be done, but they're creating a kind of incentives of the possibilities for sustainable agriculture. The citizens get empowered. They start also influence the politicians with their data and by creating some kind of transparency. So the balance in this system, in the whole governance, is changing over there. And what's often happening is that, citizens and companies, they get more empowered. And once they get more empowered, they will also do things for the good. That they're quite happy to contribute often to it, on the conditions, of course, that they don't need huge investments and they can also profit from it from themselves. So the whole system and the way we treat public administration is changing, because in the past we had those policymakers. Those policymakers were in their ivory towers. They had all the data, they make the decisions, they provide recommendations to the politicians, and the politicians look at it and could only say yes, because it's quite hard to give to oppose data when you have a policy report in it. So by opening and creating transparency, we have all kinds of shift in the governance and the part of it, and we need also new ways of arranging the institutions for that. Also think about that data might be much easier, much more difficult to do, and that things dependent on each other. Because you can use also data to say from, oh, we should do this, and then somebody else is coming. No, look, I found another data set, and we should do that. We should go the other way, and then somebody else is looking from the data. No, I found that we should this. So we get also into the discussions and the discourse about what are the right directions. And of course, it can be misused of people saying from, you see, my point is proven in this way. But more important is the engagement, that we start deliberating about what are the possible ways, and that we also should ensure that we have the participation and the engagement, that we're not looking for a single answer, but providing the insight, and take the citizens and companies with you, because else you will lose them and they will only listen to the answer to it. And then you think, I know now how to do it. Well, there's no best information arrangement. It's dependent on how, if you want to arrange this, it's dependent on the architecture. It's not we need a platform or a decentralized architecture or whatever. There are various ways to shape it. And also aspects like trust, power, and also the involvement of organizations. They shape not only how the architecture is used, but also the governance of the information exchange and what is possible. And we know examples in which the data is opened, and in similar examples, data is not opened. So there are a lot of aspects that play a role. And the disappointing part as a researcher, maybe we always try to find the best way of arrangement, which is really context specific, and you have to really go into detail to understand it. So there's no best arrangement that's all the best in all situations. You really should know the situation at hand. And things getting more difficult right now. That's why I like to show this example. The city of Den Haag, near the beach, near the North Sea over there. Delft is here at the bottom of this picture. And they have a lot of decisions made, thousands of pages each year. And well, as a citizen, you're not able to keep track on all those decisions and on the text. So what they have nowadays in almost every city in the Netherlands is a tool they use based on machine learning that reverses it. If you're interested in certain topic, interested in certain neighborhood, they will push the information to you, just a few lines, not as complex documents. And the colors in this picture show that's more regulation. This is in the middle, but Den Haag is here. This is the city centers, a lot of regulations, a lot of information, but some other area that are lighter, there's less regulations each year, so they have less information overload. So they try to get into citizens' engagement and involvement by making it very simple for them to find and know the situation by pushing it to them instead of the traditional pull. And a lot of new technology can create insight in it. And I think that results into transparency. And that's why it's also more than transparency in the title of this presentation. And another part that is highly discussed is the data collaborative. We need to collaborate together on the data, because not only the government has a lot of data, but citizens do measure a lot of data, and companies have a lot of data. And what's the idea behind the data collaborative is that they start collaborating together, start sharing the data for the good, and then we come at better insights and looking at it. That's the concept of data collaborative, but that means also you have the right parties involved. And as a recommendation, if you want to use such a data collaborative, don't start with developing your own infrastructure or platform, because that results in yet another infrastructure. Try to use what already exists and try to collaborate based on that. And that's why data collaboratives is very important. So it's not about open public data, but it's also data from citizens and companies. And nowadays, as an example for pollution measurement, a lot of people, they don't trust the government. They buy a device, and not very expensive, 10, 20 euros. €1 is $1 approximately, and they can start measuring the pollution themselves. And if you have thousands of citizens, you have thousands of measurement points. So you have an immense amount of data that can be used for that purpose. And one of the final things I want to talk about is that often we talk about opening data and we just talk about one part of the whole life cycle. We have to look at the whole life cycle that is relevant. So we have to think about the whole data creation. In this case, we talk about data cubes. Data cubes is when you have multi-dimensional data. You connect all kinds of data together. It's not about only one part of it, but it's from the beginning, the collecting, processing of the data, the opening of the data, the publishing of the data, in this case in the cubes, but also about the engagement cycle, the remaining cycle in part of it, in which you show the data, you provide incentives for starting using the data, and we have to research also the incentive that the public start analyzing the cubes, but maybe also policymakers should help the public if they have a certain questions, to help them to process the data, to communicate the results, and then the cycle starts over and over again. So you have to look at from that point of view, many iterations, many cycles that are part of it. And then you get some things like this. This is the example of the Flemish government with that about the environmental data, and they look at from a citizens, civil servants, and company point of view. They can ask questions with the data. So citizens want to know the emissions in the neighborhood. The civil servants want to know what is reported and how does it comply with the law and regulations, and how can we inspect it. And maybe a company wants to compare the emissions and with similar companies and look for best practices and try to reduce the emissions, something like that. So we can have a win-win-win situation for all. So that's a way to look also at it, the different stakeholder perspectives, so we have different insights from the data. To wrap it up, opening more and more data, but usage lags behind. We want to have more than transparency. It's not about transparency, but it's about doing something with the data. We need to look at the data, and we need also to open more data, and that means also that the traditional relationship between the government and the public is changing. And really, with data collaboratives, it can be that companies, the public, and governments are working in such a way together that the whole relationship is changed. Who provides the expertise, who provides the insights. There's a huge need for new type of governance models to collaborate, to share it. There's a lot of insights needed for how to deal with those technology. I give you some examples, but those might be the easy examples or the examples that can serve as some kind of novelty, but we have to do it also in other settings. And there's so many factors that are part of it that we are quite struggling with understanding it. This is a very complex landscape where we need much insight in it. And I didn't go into transparency literature. I didn't go into all the open data literature. There's a lot around over there that we can delve into it. So we need a lot of research. We already know a lot of doing it, but we are not there yet. Let me know if there are any questions.
Katina, I think you would agree with me that we were treated to excellent presentations today. And I've had the good fortune of hearing Scarlett and Andrew speak both formally and also in research presentations, covering so many themes, so many rich themes, as I said previously. And I'm sure their presentations have prompted some reflections on your part, some questions even. Before inviting any audience questions, I would like to turn to you for some initial thoughts, some reflections, and some thoughts that you have, the questions that you have, excuse me.
Well, we've sure been graced by all of you today, Roba, yourself included. I know yourself, Scarlett, and Andrew are working on a very important project, many to come, I hope, and it's wonderful to see auxiliary themes coming from that research. I know tight-knit groups actually hit very high when they're working closely together over a long time. So it's wonderful to see that collaboration, and we are the fortunate recipients of that here at the Pitt Colloquium at ASU. I also want to say they were probably two of the most succinct talks. Professor Marin also, as we just heard, a wonderful foray into open government, Scarlett, social security and its size and the parameters and the analytics and the mining and the vulnerable communities, and Andrew with the right of erasure and the right to be forgotten, and the GDPR and its importance, and that key point which you have so eloquently positioned of we can't have it both ways. We seem not to be able to win as consumers any which way we look at it, even if data is in our awareness and how it's being used, and even if it's not, we're sort of it's a double whammy on both sides. Roba, I have some questions if we have time. The first question I've got to thank you so much. The first question I have is to Scarlett, and wow, Scarlett, you broke it down so clinically, and we were talking about discriminating against the discriminated. I have a question in the chat which talked about, is this double discrimination or discrimination squared? What's the real effect to vulnerable communities when things go wrong with government systems?
Yeah, listen, it's a great question. The tricky thing about this is often you can't really tell right at the end what's the cause of the harm. So, for example, if you're a social security lawyer, and I still have a lot of contact, even though I'm not currently practicing because I work on the board of a legal center that does this, often you get this kind of decontextualized case at the end. So the lawyer themselves, the recipient, so you might have a review that's questionable, a debt that's questionable, et cetera, but you're not even sure where it's come from. So one of the issues is the chain of kind of decision making is very opaque. So these systems aren't fully automated, unlike Robodebt, which was much more automated. So you do have people, you know, they're not the decision. There's a system, and then people use that system. So it's really difficult to figure out exactly what you know, the individual outcomes are for individual recipients. What I can say is it overall produces a picture of systematic targeting of already vulnerable people. So that targeting usually looks like quite intrusive review processes that are arguably unnecessary, or if not, just unfairly distributed, so that they're targeted and no one else is targeted, or targeted much more than their counterparts on social security. Especially, you see a real distinction between, say, how aged pensioners, for example, are treated compared to the unemployed and women, primarily women. So about 97% of women on this payment for single parent pension, effectively. So we see those payments sort of continually singled out. What I think that's very much a kind of, it's not a complete break with past practice. So it's a continuation of a pattern that was already occurring. What I think these systems do is just automate them, and kind of give them some more legitimacy in the past than they were. So before, you had to say, oh, we're going to target single mothers, or we're going to target the unemployed. And that still happens. You still see that happen in policy where they're saying, oh, we're the unemployed, they need to meet more obligations, they have higher standards we want them to meet because of these reasons, and therefore we're going to target them in this way. So it still happens. But when we do these other compliance activities with these tools, we can use the kind of mask, we're putting it in a neutral language of risk and distancing ourselves from actually having to say we're targeting single mothers. And that in itself creates a kind of a different problem, a different way of targeting people. So definitely not a full break from the past, different kinds of problems, really difficult to pinpoint precise kind of outcomes in the sense of, but what I see is a general picture of more targeting, which means more intrusive, more frequent inquiries into these people's lives. And that obviously has a kind of flow-on effect. It also can be a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if you're going to keep targeting those people, you're going to find more, and then you're going to keep targeting them. So it can sort of just continue on indefinitely. So that's kind of, I hope that answers your question. It doesn't really have, sometimes, in the challenge of this research is sometimes you miss the concrete. And I can certainly saw that my interviewees missing the concrete outcomes of their work.
It sure does. That answers my question. And I think Robert may have a related question. I'm not sure.
I do actually. I was just thinking, as Scarlett was mentioning the distancing mechanism or aspect, Scarlett, you mentioned in your talk categories of customer data, and I often wonder, and we've spoken to this point, all of us on this call, in fact, about the issue potentially being in the categorization of a citizen as a customer, providing the potential for customer work, which Katina and I and our team have spoken about in the context of an editorial recently. So what this does is, in addition to the distancing that you're speaking about, although yours is slightly different, it places the responsibility on the citizens in the guise of self-service and in the interest of efficiency. In your opinion, and based on some of the aspects you spoke about the human, the values that you've spoken to at least Andrew and myself in the past, do you think we need some kind of reframing that centers the human as more than just a customer? So is this partly the problem here? And do you have any thoughts you'd be happy to share?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I certainly think it's part of the context in which this is enabled to happen. So the kind of introduction of the word customer is quite a clear decision that happened in 1997 in Australia with the introduction of Centrelink. So there was a rebranding. So the rebranding, it became a kind of, since been re-bureaucratized in a funny way, but at the time it was a kind of creating a self-service one-stop shop that was independent to government, that you would sort of, that government agencies would contract Centrelink to provide human services. And the people on benefits, which were called different things, sometimes customers, but not exclusively, prior to that, all became customers and everyone had to use it. So it was a policy. And they explicitly used the word Centrelink, so you couldn't shorten it. So it didn't sound like the DHS or the, whatever departments usually sound like. So it was an explicit break with that practice. And as part of that was a reconceptualization as the person in receipt of welfare as a customer that apparently has choice. But of course, if they're this kind of person apparently shopping for human services. But because the system is so targeted, it's so bureaucratic, it's so highly means tested, there's not really a great deal of choice. And maybe the choice is not to claim a payment and not pay your rent and claim a payment. Doesn't really sound much like a choice to me. So certainly, there might be a very basic choice, but whether that's a genuine choice is a real question. So it kind of seems to play down the stakes. So what we're talking about here is not doing some internet shopping. We're talking about accessing income that could be the difference between people feeding their family that week or not. Okay, so the kind of concept of customer underpins all this. That does really reduce, or seemingly like the symbolic power of that is to reduce the stakes of what's at play here. And so if we get this wrong, if we target people, it's not just about people not getting the right shoes, and listen, that could be a problem too, right? I'm not saying that's not a problem, but it's a very different problem of getting a $20,000 debt incorrectly, or even if you don't get the debt, of being identified as suspicious and your life investigated. And what it is, your life investigated, because all these investigations, they're not about, what you did outside. It's about who lives with you, what your job is like. Did your kids attend school? You know, how many children you have, are they actually living with you all the time? Did you split up with your partner? So by their nature, the questions are intimate as well. So even if nothing happens, there's zero debt, the investigation or review process itself can be a punishment. So in that sense, I don't like the concept of customer because I think it's inaccurate, but it also has a role to play in downplaying what's at stake, and that I think can sanitize the process and help that distance to, you know, to become, you know, it sort of facilitates the distance.
That's certainly a systemization of harm. I think that was the term you used to express, Scarlett. It's actually a shocking term, particularly because vulnerable members of the community don't have a fixed address mainly and don't know where they're living, don't know how many people were in their house, and don't know how many kids they're actually looking after at once sometimes. We have evidence to suggest that the robo-debt scandal actually did cause quite a substantive number of suicides based on wrong debt collection letters, and that will infiltrate out into the public soon in a bigger way. I know that there was a committee hearing announcement just yesterday on further evidence of that OCI. I won't call it a bungle, but disaster, and disastrous for the human, for the end user. You know, as you said, customers buy things. No one's buying anything here. They're just, yeah, they're not buying anything. I have another question for you, Scarlett. I'm sorry, Robo, I think we're going to go a little bit over time. 452 million interaction points is excessive. I've always taught sensitive data, whether physical biometrics or behavioral biometrics, have to have a specific use. You just can't create them willy-nilly without saying, oh, we'll use it for this reason, and if you don't use it, you ditch it. In this instance, can we say that the Australian federal government may be at risk of breaching its own Australian Privacy Act? Would you go that far? And do they have any data policies or data mining policies that are transparent enough for us to get through?
Listen, it's certainly something that requires a bit more thought before I give you a conclusive answer on this. What I will say, though, is that the way that the system operates currently is to have a lot of carve-outs for compliance, because it's to enforce potential breaches of the law. So in that sense, it can be a kind of that there are sort of legislative provisions that enable this kind of work to go on, but also systems like including robo-debt that was found to be unlawful for, you know, these don't have legal basis, right? So they just operate in the bureaucracy, right? So that makes it challenging in itself, because even the establishment of them is sort of without legal basis, and that's a real criticism of them for a range of reasons, including being able to sort of understand that they exist to start with, see what they do, and then also to ensure that they're fulfilling existing legislation, which may be inadequate, but at least fulfilling the legislation and principles that we have. So including in the Privacy Act, there's quite a lot of carve-outs for sort of enforcement activities, which includes protecting public revenue. So it can be often seen as an exception. And this is often why we see these kinds of systems proliferate in terms of fraud and compliance, because there's that kind of carve-out. In terms of actually using things like mouse clicks, like that kind of digital welfare state data, it's not currently used. They would have had to at least add that to their privacy notice. But I can't see initial, and this is very much an initial, I'd have to do a proper legal analysis of this and get some expertise from a privacy lawyer down the hall here, but that I can't see any reason why it couldn't, because it's a legislative goal of Social Security to minimize. So it's literally a legislative goal to minimize sort of incorrect payments. Eligibility and verification review are core business. So they're not sort of, you know, it's not ancillary. At the moment, the privacy policies around that sort of digital welfare state data is about improving the services. But I can't see any particular barriers to them extending that at this stage, subject to some further legal analysis.
Well, Charlotte, what a response. I know every person I've ever spoken to doesn't want to reach that telephone line of doom and waiting. You know, talk about distance. You couldn't be more distant. But yes, if they're relying on our voice prints as evidence to log us in without that special password, then we might be waiting for some time. It's a very interesting conundrum. I might move over towards Andrew. And Andrew, I have one question. I don't know which one to ask you first. maybe that question about data production, I don't know which one you want to answer. I've got two in the chat. One is on the GDPR as hard law, and you mentioned rights as a form of technology, which I thought that was superb. But we also look at rights as soft law. Sometimes if it's not legally binding, it's there to sort of place soft pressure on big tech, you know, to comply. Soft law measures can include standards, policies, processes, guidelines. And now if you're telling us, rights are a type of technology, might they extend to applying pressure on FAM and to comply with data protection? And what's your advice regarding the unrelentless data production there? And will this implode in the future? What's your prediction?
Yeah, so thanks. I don't know, Katina. I think that I imagine that it is intended to do that. I imagine that the GDPR, that erasure there is intended to essentially slow down the FAMG, right? It's like slow down datification and slow it down as a privatized activity, essentially. So, for example, you cannot ask, there are numerous types of state agencies that you can't ask to have your data erased, most notably the police. I think it's intended to slow down privatized data collection, which is essentially unwarranted and is a kind of a frenzy. But I don't think it will do. I don't think it will do very much. I don't think it will actually, and in fact, I don't think technically, I don't think it's actually possible for it to do very much. I think we're already sort of past it. So it's if it's an opening salvo, it's a very modest one. And in terms of what to do, it's sort of interesting to think about what Maren was saying about transparency and open government and, you know, opacity and who can see who and why, you know, what are the kind of visibility rights that different players have. And I initially sort of thought that maybe you can just make arguments about transparency and about data commons and those kinds of arguments, but actually I don't think that will work. I don't think that really cuts it, and I think that people have to make arguments which are much more explicit about opacity and illegibility. So not just that I could ask permission to leave the data set, but that I could ask to just be illegible. You know, to just not go into the data set or to be obfuscated somehow as I pass through it. So I think that's, I mean, in some ways it's about, I mean, like you were saying, Scarlett, it's because it's possible to capture the data, they just capture it, and then they do things with it. So in a way, it's not a technological problem. It's a set of political problems, and it's in the case of the FAMG, it's problems about the business model. You know, it's a business model that develops in a weird way, in a slightly kind of Wild West regulatory regime, and then privacy law, which is, you know, built up on other kinds of technologies like the archive, turns to it and goes, oh wait, that suddenly happened, and we need to think and talk about that now.
I might pass on to Roba. I can hog the stage with questions with both of you, but I'll pass on to Roba.
Thank you, Katina. Thank you, Andrew. I think you're quite right, and in terms of the technology not necessarily being the core issue here, and more referring to the business model and the implications there. And I know there is traction in the research community in that particular space, but it does require what we believe would be a transdisciplinary approach. Certainly, we've spoken about the need for interdisciplinarity. I think we're almost out of time, but I am curious to ask you a question about your book, Andrew, because the presentation that you delivered today is one chapter, I believe you said chapter 3 in your forthcoming book, which, as I said earlier, is provisionally titled Destruction of Documents. I'm wondering if you could share any additional thoughts or insights from your book relevant to the topics raised today or in today's session, pointing perhaps to some of what you perceive to be the solutions to the role of government, and just any other chapters you think we might be interested in. I'm sure all of them are great, but in terms of coverage, perhaps what you intend to cover.
Sure. So in a way, I'm interested in the history of, like, I'm situating erasure relative to disposition, right? To document disposition processes, both as ordinary conventional processes in terms of people figuring out what goes into an archive and what doesn't, or what is probity and records management, but also in terms of emergencies where people have felt that they had to destroy documents either because they wanted to cover something up or because they thought that they would come to nefarious ends if they didn't. So that broad kind of context around administrative media and its handling. And that's connected, I think, to political and social ideas around remembering and forgetting, and the ideas that we were kind of talking about today about who gets to see what and why, and to what ends is that visibility put. And I find as I go on, the longer I do it, the more it becomes about political imperatives and essentially about forms of political power, which are often obfuscated. And so one of the in a way, one of the tragedies is how we're so well socialized to think about administration as an ordinary and normal process, that we're in a way going to sort of take it for granted that, oh, look at this technically neutral and objective or scientific process which is going to just do something sensible. Or, of course, it would be very strange if the government were handling my personal data in an irregular way. And so we're sort of trusting large systems that in a way are innately unreliable and to some extent untrustworthy. And even if we feel safe, many other people are not going to be safe. And so in a way, you end up going two ways, I think. And one way you end up going is towards illegibility, and talking about ways to just not just exit, but ways to not be seen, opacity. And that's one way that you end up going, and I think lots of people do kind of end up going that way. And the other way I think that people end up going is towards greater regulation and further investment in these systems. And perhaps everyone, people have to do a bit of both, or people have to decide what they want to do, because I'm slightly suspicious that now that the kind of cat is out of the bag, now that we have ubiquitous datification, how are we going to get away from this technology? We're not really sort of competent to do it anymore. So yeah, I don't know if that sort of answers it, or I think that's where I've kind of gotten to in terms of the sort of the shapes that move around in the back of that, those trying to read and write as much as I can about document disposal and data erasure.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We very much look forward to reading your book. I think it's really interesting, your coverage of aspects such as power, trust, and a lot more that are really consistent across the three presentations today. Just briefly before we wrap up, Scarlett, I might turn to you for a moment, if you could share any information with us about your forthcoming book related to your talk as well, about policing welfare, governing welfare fraud and non-compliance. If you can just sort of succinctly provide an overview of what you hope to achieve with that.
Yes. Well, it's good because it's due just in a couple of weeks, the manuscript, so it's pretty close to on its way. But basically it's a examination of the full gamut of tools and technologies that are used to police welfare fraud and non-compliance, with a focus on the Australian context, but certainly embedded in the kind of international or at least Western literature, and drawing comparisons elsewhere. So it looks at and categorizes these different technologies into the kind of different logics and to which they're aligned. So I look at preemptive technologies, which I include in their robo-debt. So it's not about risk, it's about capturing in the entire population, about casting a whole population as risky. And in there also looks at sort of identity fraud and other claim verification processes, how they operate, their effects, and kind of how they sit with each other. The other chapters look at things like what I call responsibilizing strategies. So where we ask members of the community to police each other. So things like tip-offs, as well as we ask welfare recipients to police themselves. So we ask them to self-correct and talk about their responsibility to sort of self-scrutinise, as well as things like actual fraud prosecutions and the use of intelligence-led policing and the kind of establishment of a whole police force effectively in the welfare state and the effects of those. And I think looking at it all together, it's very much contributed to a kind of more punitive welfare state. These processes of criminalising welfare fraud have definitely extended beyond the problem of fraud per se, and they affect how welfare it's delivered. But I also try to pay attention, as I have in this presentation, to the kind of points of where things don't fit or don't match, where there's been contest and challenge. So I try to kind of be a bit more nuanced in the kind of overarching, totalizing, punitive welfare state, as if, because I think that's quite pessimistic too. Where do we go from there? So I try to examine moments of more progressive change and or where we can instill more progressive values in the welfare state. So that's a bit of a summary. Hopefully it'll be finished soon and out next year.
Very much looking forward to that as well, Scarlett. And that's what I appreciate with both yourself and Andrew, that nuanced approach to all your work to see where to go to from here. And unfortunately, where we're going from here is we're out of time. So
we could do this. Oh, I love this.
It's very common. It's very common when we're in discussion with Andrew and Scarlett. I must say that time flies, certainly. But we would like to thank our wonderful guests, Dr. Scarlett Wilcock, Dr. Andrew Whelan, and of course, Professor Marion Jansen, for their time and also their willingness to share with us their work and really engage in this really important transdisciplinary dialogue. For those who are interested, we have an extended version of this presentation, this session, including a reflection and Q&A session with Professor Jansen on open government and related themes, and that will be available shortly. This extended version, inclusive of the recording for today's session, will be posted on the School for the Future of Innovation in Society's YouTube channel, and we'll also be making it available on IEEE TV. Again, my co-host Katina Michael and I would like to thank you all for your attendance. Thank our wonderful guests and our events team for their continued support. And as always, we look forward to seeing you in the next session of Series 4 of the PIT Colloquium. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Katina.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Marion Jansen, for generously giving your time today to join our colloquium and what I would say is an international forum for discussion on the public interest, a theme that I would say has underpinned your presentation today as you describe the relationship between governments and citizens in open government context, the significance of transparency, of trust, and certainly the value of the need for emergent governance models. I would like to invite my co-host, Professor Katina Michael, to reflect on your talk and ask any questions she may have before returning perhaps to a question or two of my own.
Well, weren't we spoiled today, Robert, listening to Professor Jansen and really honing in on public oversight and innovation environment, the inside in and the outside in, and looking at how people can access data. This is taxpayer-generated data we're talking about. In 2015, I was asked to consult for the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Australia at the federal level and talk about how that data would be broken open. Interestingly, they weren't so interested in app development because they thought that would constrain access to the population at large. They were looking at different platforms by which they could open up the data and allow people to access the data freely, whether they were, as Marion mentioned, politicians, citizens, businesses, others in the public administration or so forth. It was all about getting access to raw data. But as we saw through the case studies as well, an important intermediary role by businesses is to try and make sense of the data and make it accessible through various means to farmers, to those who need it, put it in the hands of everyday people. Interestingly, we also heard from Professor Jansen the importance of what he didn't call crowdsourcing, but did talk about sensors and putting these in thousands of people's hands and this spurring off to citizen science. Recently, we completed a paper on AI productivity and citizen science for the OECD. And it was very interesting to see that this is all wrapping into the importance of this governance requirement over who owns the data, the quality of the data, the vintage of the data, how it's being used, its completeness, and of course, in general, its quality. But looking at next steps and this important notion you've put forward about collaborative opportunities and collaboratives, but also this location-specific push to the citizen that might require it to spur on more activity. How often do you think government can reach everyday citizens, Professor, before it gets too much, where we say too much information, too little knowledge? Is there a requirement to have this touch point, and how often perhaps?
Thank you for your reflections and for your question. It's quite funny when we think about citizens, or when governments think about citizens, they think from, oh yeah, they want to interact with the government. But look at yourself. Nobody wants to interact with the government. Nobody likes. Why should we? We go to a soccer game or something like that. That's what we like. And we use some social media to interact. But let's not face it. We don't go to a government website or to interact for fun or something like that. So we have to make it attractive and provide incentives for the public to be able to interact. And that's why I recognize also what you're saying with making raw data available. That's what a lot of governments do. But what happens when you make raw data available? But often an immense amount of raw data is made available and nothing happens. And that's why you have to make also trade-off between act for experts, journalists, people who will have the time. Raw data is very useful. They can go into it, but for just the public, they can't make sense out of the raw data. You need some nice visualizations. You need some nice app, and you need some companies or maybe the government themselves to stimulate what they develop and what they're doing it, and be aware of it, because people just saying from, oh yeah, we make our data available and we are there. Well, it's not about the push side. It's not about the number of data sets, because it's so easy to open a large number of data sets without creating any value at all. So who cares about it? Then I think you're just wasting taxpayers' money, because you're opening something that is not needed. And then, yeah, the citizens, they like to collaborate if it concerns them. If it's in their backyard, then they get active, and then they become activists, or if they really care about it. What I see nowadays, that's why I like the pollution or emission data, those kind of things. People care about it. This is really an issue for them. They see from, oh, people might get ill from it. It might hurt our environment. So they become activists, kind of activists. And is that bad or not? Well, I don't know, but they have a concern and they want to express their concern. I think it's important to ensure that you have, in one way or another, that the citizens can express their concern. It's not easy to do it, to collaborate together, and we know that trust plays a role. Those who collaborate should trust each other. That's one of the conditions or a main factor on it. Also, the power balance should be a little bit even, or it might also be that one party with a lot of power takes the lead. That could also be the case. That could also be one of the factors. But there are a lot of factors that influencing it, and we often don't know that. So it's like collaborating in other type of situations. We have to watch and look for what's happening over there. And there's some anecdotal work, of course, and this was also largely anecdotal, what I presented today. There's some more general studies on it, but not for those kinds of purposes. And there's a reason for it, because we don't have that many examples. And the more examples we have, maybe we can just generalizing and looking for it, but arriving at those examples is quite challenging. And now I'm start talking, and now I forget what was your question at the beginning, Katina.
I think you answered it very well there, and you pointed at the end towards a collaborative, which is bi-directional feedback loops. It's not just the government to the citizen, but whoa, wouldn't the government love to hear from the citizen and somehow have this exchange occur and this additional feedback through interaction? I think I'll pass back to our chair, Roba, and over to you.
Thank you, Katina. I might emphasize, Professor Janssen, some of the statements you spoke about, collaboration, engagement, and so on. But even looking beyond engagement, I know some of your work, your more recent publications, for example, you focus on empowerment in open government. And the Pitt Colloquium is very much centered on exploring the role of government dynamics and relationships in terms of those who are governing and the governed, and how we develop frameworks, models, and a lot more to support and facilitate citizen empowerment. So following on from Katina's question, I'm curious, Professor Janssen, how do you envisage the empowerment, so beyond collaboration, of the citizens in the context of open government? And what do you perceive to be some of the opportunities for empowering citizens, and significantly the challenges and the barriers, some of which you touched on already?
Thank you. So also a difficult question, not easy to answer, because empowerment is a very complex construct. And we often think in this case from we give them data and now we empower them. Well, of course, nobody's empowered. Give them a lot of things, and they might be lost in it, and maybe they spend their resources in it. So to empower, there are a lot of conditions that are important. You have to have the skills and the expertise. You might need to have the infrastructure, also the access. If large volumes of data, you can't just do it on your smartphone or something like that. You might really need an infrastructure for being able to process it. So it's about setting the conditions also for empowerment. And if the conditions are not there, well, we can talk about empowerment, but it will not happen that the people feel empowered. So you have to think about what are really the conditions, the constraints which need to be satisfied. And thereafter, it's also needed to give incentives, because people often are not aware that they're able to do things. And you can have a beautiful infrastructure, nobody uses it. So you need to have a certain critical mass to stimulate and provide the incentive before they start using it. And once that happens, then we get to real empowerment. Because for me, the way to evaluate empowerment is very simple: to look at their influence from citizens on government policies. And if there's no influence at all, then they play a lot, and they participate and they engage and whatever, but then there's no real empowerment, because there's no impact at the end and no value creation. So I would also here, like you're saying, from look at the whole feedback loops and the iterations because else we take a too narrow view.
No, absolutely. So much to think about there, Professor. I think I might end on a question talking to the theme of our colloquium, if I may, which is toward transdisciplinarity. So given the theme of the colloquium and your presentation, which specifically discussed I think you framed it, the shifting relationships at all levels. And again, talking to that theme of empowerment, you mentioned the system of public administration changing and us requiring new ways of arranging institutions. In your experience, what are some of the important elements in that regard, particularly where multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity is concerned? So do you see a role for transdisciplinary approaches and frameworks, and what are your general thoughts about that theme?
Yes, I can only answer yes. It's very important, and the relevance is clear. We need more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to cover it. And what you see is each time different disciplines and different ways of looking at it might be relevant. So it's not that we're able to say we need this, or that. Each time it's dependent on the grand challenge or the type of problem we tackle, the type of expertise needed, but it's always interdisciplinary, that's for sure. And it's almost always transdisciplinary also, that's also for sure. But how to pinpoint it, it's always, I think, to put it a little bit bluntly, we need technology people, We need more the organizational people, the social people, that's for sure. They need always to be combined, but what kind of technology? It's also dependent on the situation. If you need data scientists or software engineers who would develop a platform, or maybe them all, or social scientists who understand policy making or understand the public administration structure. If we need them, probably we need them also all. And that makes it also quite complex. Because, you know, if we collaborate together with large teams, then we don't talk each other anymore because the team is too large. So we have also to keep it at a certain, certain size that is manageable. And maybe we have multiple teams that can collaborate and multiple universities that can collaborate. And then we slowly move towards this. But I think we have a long path to go. It's not easy.
Definitely. I think we would agree with you on that point, on the complexity, on the importance of talking to each other across technical and non-technical boundaries, and also the importance of expertise, which we had, in fact, a dedicated session to as part of this colloquium series. But I think that brings us to the end of this very stimulating session, Professor Jansen, of the 4th series of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. My co-host, Katina Michael, and I would like to thank you so very much for joining us today and for sharing your extensive experience and your expertise on open government and so many other rich related themes. I'm sure there are many questions to come from this discussion. There's evidently a lot of work to be done in this space, and we look forward to having those further discussions with you about what's required and the community at large. In closing, we would like to note that the recording for this session will be available on the School for the Future of Innovation in Society's YouTube channel, and we'll also be posting on IEEE TV. And we look forward to seeing you in the next session of the PIT Colloquium. To all of you who are viewing this, and to you, Professor Jansen, to further discussion and collaboration on this theme and others. A good day to everyone, and thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.